Hi quilters, this is our version of the Jelly Roll Race Quilt, but instead of using a jelly roll, we're going to use our 2.5-inch strip scraps. When I was sorting my strips, I had one bucket that was all homespuns and flannels, all in the darker, warmer colors, so this month my goal is to use up that entire bucket. This is our 4th video in a series designed to use 2.5-inch strips of fabric. The videos are perfect for using leftover strips, new strips cut from yardage, or jelly rolls. To start with, we need to sew all of these strips end to end to make one really long strip. You can either sew them end to end with a straight seam, which I will be doing here in this video, or you can sew a diagonal seam like you would sew binding strips together, and these seams would create a totally different look. At the end of the video, I'll show a version of the quilt that is done with diagonal seams instead of straight ones so that you can see the difference. I'm using every size strip no matter what the length. I found some small strips, some squares, and some half square triangles in the bucket and work those in too. I am going to sew some of those smaller pieces together to make them easier to work into the quilt. And just so you know, I am not doing the race version of this quilt. I'm going to add in some pressing and an idea to keep things tidier while you're sewing. As I'm sewing this one really long strip, I'm going to try to alternate the shorter strips and squares with longer strips so I can spread them out around the quilt top. This part is going to take a while, but in the end, I'm going to have an empty bucket, so it's all going to be worth it. And for now, I'm just going to enjoy a little bit of wonderful, mindless sewing to work off some stress. The only thing you really have to watch out for at this stage is that you're sewing right sides together, so always make sure it's right side to right side. If you're enjoying our strip quilt series, we hope you will take a moment to hit that like button and let us know in the comment section below whether you'll try this with strip scraps or would you rather use just a jelly roll. And here is the moment I have been waiting for, an empty bucket. Can you believe it? Now that all the strips are sewn together, it's time to grab a pair of scissors or a blade saver and cut them apart. I pinned the closest end to the sewing machine so I wouldn't lose it in the huge pile of fabric this long strip will make. I will pin it to the other end when I find it to keep them together. Holding onto both ends of the long strip, I'm putting it all back into my bucket for a trip to the ironing board. Now that I have my long strip made, I wanted to press the seams and the strips. I had this idea of making it into my very own jelly roll to make it easier to sew for the next step. I laid both ends wrong side up and started pressing. I'm going to press all of my seams open. I've decided to use this empty elastic spool to feed it onto. The important part of this is that the center of the spool fits on a dowel. This spool is just the right size that I can tape the ends to the spool and then side by side start winding the fabric onto the roll to make a double jelly roll. It was fun to see the double jelly roll get bigger and bigger. I just kept pressing and rolling. If I'd been using a fresh jelly roll, I might have been able to skip pressing, but my strips definitely weren't flat and it was worth it to press at this point. I could have pressed all the strips at the very beginning, but decided to press the strips and the seams at the same time to save a step. I had no idea how big the roll would get, and it was fun to make. It'll be nice to start sewing with flat strips. Once you get to the end, you will cut in between to have 2 separate jelly rolls, but they'll still be connected on this spool. The nice thing about having it rolled up on a spool like this is I can store it this way until I'm ready to use it. It'll look great on a shelf, and I might even start a few of these in other color combinations to use for future projects. This one spool of nicely organized strips certainly looks better than that messy bucket I had to start with. After I got my quilt done and by using some tricky little math, I figured out that I have about 6.78 yards of strips put onto this spool. So I feel really glad that I'm using up a lot of fabric. The step I did next was to put the spool on a dowel and then use a spare strip to hang it below my sewing machine. Now instead of having a pile of strips at my feet or on my lap, I have a spool of fabric to feed up from the bottom and send it through the machine. Now it's time for some more fun sewing. Grab both ends, put right sides together, and just make one long seam using both of the strips. For me, this kind of sewing is very therapeutic. I just send it through the machine. I don't have to think. It's relaxing stress relief. It's also very satisfying to watch the sewn pile getting bigger and bigger and the spooled strips getting smaller and smaller. You do have to stop every so often to reposition the fabric and make sure the raw edges are even. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The spool underneath worked just like I'd imagined it would. It was so easy, I loved it. Once I got close to the end, one side was maybe 20 inches longer than the other side. So I stopped sewing, I took it off the machine, and then sewed the two ends together, making sure that it wasn't twisted and right sides were together. Then I finger pressed the seam, got it back under the sewing machine foot to finish the seam. Right before you get to the very end, you're going to cut on the fold. Now you can either keep sewing or you can stop and press. I chose to stop and press just at this first stage to give me a little more flatness to work with when I start sewing the strips back together again. I put both ends together on the ironing board and press to one side. I just keep shifting it over and I keep on pressing until the whole strip set is pressed. Having both sides on the ironing board at one time helped it go a little bit faster. Once pressed, it's time to head back to the sewing machine and find the two ends. You're going to put them right sides together and start sewing. You should be able to sew this seam in half the time as the first seam. The quilt top sewing will start picking up speed from here on out because as you sew each set, every time you fold it in half end to end and start sewing, the seam is half the length as the last seam you sewed. When you get to the end, you just cut it on the fold and send it back through end to end and keep on sewing. Now we're sewing 4 strips to 4 strips. When you get to the end, cut on the fold, open it up, pull it all back towards you, and then you're going to fold it in half, end to end, and just keep sewing. So for the next step, you'll be sewing 8 strips to 8 strips. When I get to the end here, I'm going to cut on the fold and pull it back through, put it end to end, and then send it through. I'm actually going to do this 2 more times. If you were using a regular jelly roll, you would probably only need to do it 1 more time after this. For example, if you start with a jelly roll, you'd have about 1,600 inches in your big long strip. When you fold that in half end to end and sew it together, then you end up with 800 inches. That's 4.5 inches wide. Fold it in half, you have 400 inches at 8.5 wide. Fold it in half, 200 inches at 16.5 wide. Fold it in half, 100 inches at 32.5 inches wide. And then your last fold, you end up with 50 inches by 64 inches wide. So your quilt would be 50 inches by 64.5. The strips will be horizontal, so the 50 width will be the length of each of the strips that you have. You'll end up with 32 rows. Each of those rows started out at 2.5 inches wide. Once you take out the seam allowance, they're 2 inches wide, so 32 times 2 is 64 inches long. Add in that 1/2 inch of seam allowance at the top and the bottom, and you have 64.5 inches. At this point, my strip set is 64.5 inches wide and 122 inches long. So I could either cut it in half and have 2 small quilts that are about 61 by 64.5, but I only wanted to make 1 project. So I'm going to fold it in half 1 more time, end to end, and then sew it 1 more seam. And then I'll end up with something that's about 61 inches by 128.5 inches. So just for fun, I did the math backwards to figure out what I started out with. So my end result was 61 by 128. My beginning long strip ended up being 3,904 inches long. So I had a lot of sewing to do on this one. When I'm doing a lot of straight stitching like that and just working on a scrap project, I will often use this as an opportunity to, as I'm sewing, keep using up bobbins. So I'll take all the old bobbins that have just a little bit of thread left on them and sew until the thread is gone, and then just keep putting in different bobbins that have a little bit of thread left on them, just so I can clear off all those bobbins. So at this point, my quilt measures 61 inches wide and 128 inches long. I knew I didn't want it that long, so I unsewed a seam to make it measure 61 inches by 100 inches. And then I'm going to add to the sides to make it a little bit wider. I want to make it a twin size. But before I move on to the next step, I need to press it really flat. I used some Mary Ellen's Best Press spray and pressed the seams whichever way they seem to kind of want to go. Once my quilt top was nice and flat, I took the piece that I had unsewed, folded it in half, and then cut it down into 4-inch sections. If only I'd remembered to push the record button when I'd put it on the cutting table. Anyway, once they were cut, I sewed them end to end to make pieces long enough to go on each side. But before I add them to the sides of the quilt, I want to give it a little bit of a break. So I'm going to take some black strips that I have that are just extra strips from my strip pile, sew them end to end, and then I'm going to sew those onto each side first before I add the strip pieces. So it'll kind of be like a piano keyboarder. I am going to pin on the borders so that I can line up the seams so that they match, so it looks like I just kind of separated the two sides from each other with the black line on either side of the quilt. I try to avoid pinning when I can, but I knew that if I didn't pin this, those seams wouldn't match up and it would bug me. So I made sure to pin every seam all the way down on both sides. 2 seams left and this quilt is going to be ready to go. I can get it machine quilted and then put a binding on it. Since I added this black band on either side of the quilt top, I'm also going to do the binding in black. I think adding this black band to either side of the quilt was a nice touch. It made it just a little bit different and not quite so boring with just strips everywhere. While I'm still at the sewing machine, I'm going to get my binding prepared so that once it's done quilting, all I have left to do is bind. I just did a simple stipple or meander kind of quilting on this quilt. I'm going to add the binding by machine. So I'm going to sew it to the back side after I've trimmed the quilt all the way around. And then I will flip it over to the front side and top stitch it down from the front. Whenever I'm top stitching down the quilt binding, I will about every 6 or 7 inches do a couple of back stitches. That way, if the thread ever breaks in a certain area, it won't undo all of the stitching all the way across the binding. I also like to wear this grippy glove on my left hand as I'm sewing on the binding. It helps me guide the quilt with more control and less slipping on the fabric. If I don't wear the glove when I'm doing binding, my hands get really tired and start to hurt after about the first side. I use a walking foot to put the binding on when I'm adding it to the quilt top, and then when I flip it over to top stitch, I put on an open toe foot so that I can see exactly where I need to be stitching. And once the binding is done, this strip quilt is finished. I am super happy with the way that it turned out. I love the black band on either side, and the black binding finishes it off perfectly. The finished quilt measures 72 inches wide and 100 inches long. I picked a homespun woven for the backing because I thought a flannel would be too heavy and I didn't want it to be too thick when it was done. The alternate colorway I have to show you this month was also made with scraps, but I connected the strips with a diagonal seam instead of straight seam for a different look. This one is close to a standard jelly roll size of about 50 by 60. Isn't it cool how different they look from each other? Love it. This pattern is a fun one to play with, so I hope you'll have fun. I had so much fun making those jelly rolls that I made some in a red, white, and blue colorway and plain blue and plain red just to have something fun to work on in the future. Plus, the rolls look prettier on the shelf than a messy bin of strips, and they're easily accessible for projects if I need them. Last month, the strip bucket count was at 7. This month, the strip bucket count is at 6, so yay, we used a whole bucket up. We will see you again next month for another way to use 2.5-inch strips. Before you go, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!